Hello, welcome to Little Vintage World, welcome to another Tudor Timber video where I'm going to be recommending you some non-fiction books, aren't I? So these are non-fiction books for every Tudor monarch. So we're going to start at the beginning, 1485, and we're going to go all the way through to the end, 1603, recommending you one Tudor non-fiction book per monarch. Now, this was actually really difficult because I have a lot of books and in particular I have a lot of books on Elizabeth I, but we'll get to her at the end, obviously. So I'm just going to get straight into it. Now, bear in mind that there are so many books out there on these wonderful, fascinating individuals, and there's so many books that I would like to recommend, and perhaps I might do more videos in the future where I just pick one person in particular and just throw book recommendations at you. But for now, I'm doing a wide spread, a big old rainbow, so to speak. So what I've tried to do is pick a book by one specific author, one specific historian, rather than picking the same historian twice, just to try and make it nice and fair. And obviously to recommend their work, because so many of these historians and these writers are fantastic. So let's go straight into it. So 1485, we have the birth of the Tudors, don't we? With, of course, Henry VII. And the book that I'm going to recommend to you is this one. This is Thomas Penn's Winter King, The Dawn of Tudor England. This book is one of the most popular that I kind of see on Henry VII himself. It focuses on the reign of Henry VII and what he is like as king and monarch of the Tudor age, but does kind of come back to his previous life when he wasn't king and how his previous life has influenced his position as king, if that makes sense. It's quite a fascinating book. It is quite heavy, I will say that. It's one of these books that I haven't ever read in full go, in a full wallop. It's a book that I've picked bits out of every now and then. I've read a chapter, put it back on the shelf, read a chapter, and I've worked my way through it rather slowly, but it is really interesting and I do recommend it if you want a book on Henry VII. Now next up, you'd think, oh okay, next in line comes Henry VIII, but oh no, because do you know who deserved really to be monarch? Elizabeth of York. So Elizabeth of York was the daughter of Edward IV, and she was the sister of the Princess and Tower. Now, of course, the Princess and Tower go missing, and I think she should have then been queen. However, England, they said, wasn't ready for a queen, so she wasn't allowed it. But Elizabeth of York, Forgotten Tudor Queen by Amy Licence. I have quite a few books on my shelf by Amy Licence. You can actually see a couple up here. Those are also non-fiction. I have more by Amy Licence, and I find her writing fascinating because is there a more truthful, you know, a spade is a spade historian out there? In this book, Amy actually says at one point, there isn't much on Elizabeth's life at this time. And she's completely open and honest about the fact that there is very little evidence that is surrounding it. And I'd much rather have that than try and suggest otherwise and try and make stuff up and make guesses. I'd rather just go, oh, okay, there isn't much there in terms of primary source evidence for us to go on. And I like that. And I love how Amy always puts the mundane, the little nitty gritty bits, which for me really bring a person to life. So yes, Elizabeth of York by Amy Licence, but also Amy Licence's other books. I've spoken about Amy before. I think she's a wonderful historian. Next, we are getting to Henry VIII. Boom. This is the book that I'm going to recommend that you pick up. This is Henry Virtuous Prince by David Starkey. This book, oh, this book is good. I've read this book so many times. It is beautiful on the inside as it is on the outside. This book is about Henry at a point in which I actually really like him. There comes to a point with me and Henry where I do change my mind about him and think he is such a turd on a stick. But there is a point where that happens. around, you know, 1530s. But before that, I'm like, oh, he's all right. And then before that, I'm like, oh, actually, as a young man, as a young king, actually quite virtuous, quite nice. There's lots of primary source information out there about how much of a kind king he was. And there's so much positivity around his young kingship, shall we say. And that's what this book talks about. This book talks about Henry's birth, time that he was prince, and the beginning, very beginning of his reign. And so essentially, I want everyone to read this book because this is a very, very different side of Henry VIII. I will never change my mind about Henry VIII at all, but this does certainly give another side to him, and I think everyone should read this. After the death of Henry VIII, we of course then have his son, Edward VI. This is Edward VI, The Lost King of England, The Struggle for the Soul of England and the Death of Henry VIII by Chris Skidmore. I really enjoy this book. This is a full-length biography and a bit more. So we talk about the whole life of Edward VI. Well, obviously he died very young, but we get his whole life and then we get the bit afterwards. So the bit that he changed to change history, change royal history, and a lot of innocent lives, sadly, some of which we'll get to soon, were lost. And this book covers that as well, because of course it was his signing, his implementation that got that ball, unfortunately, rolling. But I really appreciate this book because this book isn't about a child king or a boy. That's not what this book does. This book is so respectful of Edward because Edward, yes, he was a child, but he had his own ideas. He was so focused on what he wanted to implement as king, and he certainly started to do that, obviously later on in his reign. And personally, had I think he'd have lived even a few years longer, I think we would have seen the tyrannical ruler to match his father. He was a powerhouse, and yeah, you can really see the fundamentals of the king that he would have been, and the king that he was as well. It's absolutely fascinating, and I highly recommend that you get this book. After the death of Edward VI, thanks to Edward, we then have Lady Jane Grey, and the book that I'm going to recommend to you, of course, is Crown of Blood, The Deadly Inheritance of Lady Jane Grey by Nicola Tallis. This book is fascinating, and it's so emotively written as well. Lady Jane Grey, she breaks my heart, and you might be like, why is she here? She's here because she was queen. She's known as the 9-day queen, but technically queen for 13, so less than 2 weeks. Queen for less than 2 weeks. And her life was cut way too short, but this book, I've done a full biography of this book. It's so emotive, it's so powerful, and you really feel like you learn about who Lady Jane herself was rather than what was happening to her and at the period. So wonderful, wonderful biography. Then of course, after Lady Jane Grey and her family are imprisoned, we of course get The Rising of Mary Tudor, the First Queen by Linda Porter. Linda Porter has written a few books on some Tudors and also other areas of history as well. And this is a really interesting biography on Mary because this really focuses on trying to change people's perceptions of Mary and take that kind of stigma that she has away from her and really show the true woman of her rather than what history has kind of, you know, the label that history has labelled her with. And I think it's fascinating. And finally, last but not least, my historical heroine, Elizabeth I. This was the hardest book to pick because I could have picked from so many, but I did go for this one. This is Elizabeth the Queen by Alison Weir. I love Alison Weir's writing. I mean, ta-da! But I think she writes wonderful historical fiction, which makes me cry, and fascinating historical non-fiction as well. I really enjoy her writing style, and as I said, there's so many books out there on Elizabeth, but I do think this is just a wonderful biography on her, and particularly her time as queen. So there we have it. There is a book recommendation for you for each Tudor monarch. I hope this video has been helpful. Let me know if you have read any of these books in the comments section below. I love chatting to you as always, and I shall see you very, very soon for the next video. Take care for now. Bye.